Two, one, let's see. All right. Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Brass, and with me is William Collins. How are you doing, my good sir?
I'm doing very well, and thank you for having me.
Oh, no problem. Um, on my channel, I have a tendency of interviewing MRAs and general political and some political figures and the like. That's sort of my take. And I had been a massive fan of your work after going through your work at the ICMI and also going through some of the books that you've written. So, you know, and I've interviewed multiple people that you probably know, like such as Hannah Wallen, Paul Elam, pretty much all the honey badgers except for like Karen and I'm working on those. But
Yeah, you
yeah,
you you, you probably left the best till last there, have you, with Karen Strawn?
yeah. Um, well, I mean, she's like one of my favorites of
Oh
all
yeah, she's got a lot to answer for, that woman.
the.
There's
Yeah.
a lot of MRAs date their conversion to watching her videos in circa 2010 to 2013.
Oh yeah.
I think I'm one of them.
Oh well, I mean, she's her work has definitely helped me out too, especially like her work on like domestic violence and stuff like that. That's definitely like one of the big things that her how what she did helped me out. And so I want you to tell the audience a little bit about yourself, like, give it like a brief synopsis or whatever.
Yeah. All right. I hate talking about myself, but people always start with that question, so I should be used to it. I'm a retired engineer. My At university, my subject was theoretical physics, and I still do publish in physics occasionally. But I always earned a crust as a mechanical engineer, working in the electricity generation industry. I actually retired from full-time work 10 years ago, but since then I've had a number of different involvements, including um, both temporary and honorary positions at a university, again in the engineering department. Um, and also I do work under contract still, um, which sort of keeps my hand in. So that's my sort of professional side. But as you will note, that's got nothing whatsoever to do with what we'll be talking about tonight.
Yeah,
So in terms of how I got interested in these issues, gender issues, and the male perspective on gender issues, I suppose the trite answer to that is that, I became interested simply by being a man living in this world. And that is true. But as the thing you really need to know about me, which is slightly unusual, or at least it's unusual for men in this movement, is that I'm not one of the burnt men. I'm not one of the men that's been damaged by the system in some way. So most men that get interested in these things come to it because they've had parental separation and child custody issues, and they've seen just how appalling the family courts are, and all the ancillary services that go with that. Or if it's not that issue, it'll be false allegations of some sort, or simply being discriminated against in the workplace or at university. So all these things will be familiar to you if you've been following the work of either myself or other spokespeople for the men's movement. Um, but I've not been affected by any of them. I say that in my book, The Empathy Gap, that right at the beginning, that I myself have not suffered from any of these disadvantages that I fill nearly 700 pages of detail with. Um, but I know a lot of men that have. In fact, virtually all the men I know have. I'm one of the lucky ones. So how did I get interested in it? I mean, this is a good question. The even better question, I suppose, is why are so many people not interested in it? Why are so many people blind to what I call the empathy gap? In other words, blind to the male disadvantages, blind to the falsity of the feminist perspective, which is, you know, stands reality on its head. So what's different about me and other MRAs that we've seen it? That's a good question about my own psychology, which I'm not sure I can answer, but all I can say is it goes back a very long way in my case, because I first started getting concerned about these issues. Certainly in the early 80s, I was already concerned about them. Having, you know, earlier on, I mean, I was a teenager before feminism took off in the UK. So I saw it happen. And it was presented to us at the time as a quest for equality. And it sounded perfectly reasonable at the time, because it was true that men dominated massively in just about every external sphere. So there was a logic there. So, you know, I would have been happy, I suppose, at one time to call myself a feminist, although I don't think I ever actually went that far. But I would certainly have applauded their aims and supported them. I mean, I went to an all-male college at university, and I remember having a meeting between the students and the staff to try and persuade the staff to go co-ed and allow women into the college. So, you know, I was not certainly not a misogynist at that point. I'm not a misogynist now either, but many people might label me as that. So, yeah, I mean, the beginnings of it were very different from what it later became. But even 10 years, 12 years later, by the early 80s, I was already seeing that there was something pernicious going on. And that, I mean, I didn't have any time to do anything about it then. You know, like everyone else, I was trying to forge my way in the world and get on in a career and so on. And then shortly after that, starting a family. So I had other things to do, but I mean, my concern just deepened. You know, my wife took the Guardian newspaper, so that was lying around the house, and I'd occasionally dip into it and be appalled at the bias of the articles in there. And then in the early 90s, there was a flurry of books came out. There was, first of all, in 1992, there was a book called No More Sex War by Neil Linden. You probably never heard of it because it was a UK book that I don't think sold very well at all. But note, this was the year before Warren Farrell's Myth of Male Power, which came out in 93. Another book that came out in 93 was a book called Not Guilty. I forget the name of the author now, something Thomas. And I was on those three books immediately they came out. So you can see that my concern had deepened to the point, whereas you know, I was following what was happening, such as in as far as anything was happening. And we know what happened to Warren Farrell. It marked a bit of a hiatus in his career, should we say, when The Myth of Male Power came out. Well, Neil Linden's fate was even worse. Neil Linden in 1992, when he published No More Sex War, was a high-flying journalist. He was the sort of journalist that could get interviews with the great and the good. He was going places. And then he published that book, which is a very hard-hitting anti-feminist book, probably the first really hard-hitting anti-feminist book, I would think. And his career came to a shuddering full stop immediately. And he spent the next 10 years surviving by writing about motor cars and such things, very low-grade journalism. That's all the work he could get. So there we are. Cancel culture goes back a long way. It's not a recent phenomenon. It's been part of feminism from the start. So yeah, I mean, I'm rambling a bit, but yeah, I'm just stressing that my concern goes back many decades. But it was only in 2013 that I started blogging, and that it's no coincidence. That's when I was beginning to go part-time at work, preparatory to retiring. and so I had the time, and also I wasn't so financially vulnerable to writing things that my quite what we'd now call a woke corporation that I worked for wouldn't particularly enjoy what I was reading, what I was writing. So I was very sensitive to the issue of being given the boot before I was ready to go. So it's no coincidence I was retired before I really took up the cudgels and started writing big time. But once I started, my goodness, the floodgates were open, and I don't know how many words I've written since, but it must be pushing 1 million words by now, I would think.
Yeah. I mean, and that's just the 700-page book.
Well, that's probably 250,000 of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember, I believe you had done a lecture on that as well, and I remember you said that you could have actually made the book a lot longer if you wanted to.
Yes, and I've got the proof of that, because there's another near 700-page book very nearly ready to come out, and this one will be a compilation essentially of my blog articles over the last 10 years, but without duplicating the material that's in the first book. So it's very much complementary. So yeah, I mean, I could have made it twice as long. I've proved that now.
So from what I'm hearing, you're not like one of the people that can just sort of silently go into the night when you retire. You're more like of a workaholic type.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, there's never a dull moment. I mean, being retired to me means just being differently employed. I mean, I still do paid work a little bit, but I can now pick and choose. So I'll only do work that interests me, because I don't have to do it for the money, thankfully.
Yeah.
But as I have done a lot of work for a charity, a father's charity. And I do a lot of writing, and I do still do technical work out of interest. So I pursue topics in physics, not with any particular aim in mind, although occasionally it leads to a publication. So yeah, I don't know the meaning of boredom. It's a foreign world to me, thankfully.
Yeah. So yeah, you're not the type of person that's just going to be, retire to golf for the rest of your life.
Absolutely not. No, I mean, my dread is that my health fails, so that I can't work anymore, and then that'll be the end of me, I think. But touch wood, I'm still firing on all cylinders at the moment.
Yeah. And what I liked about your book was about how meticulously detailed it was, and how sort of multifaceted it is, where it doesn't just like go over like one dimension of it, because I know, and I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong about that, because everyone has their own expertise. Some people focus like more on the statistical side, some people focus more strictly on the history side of it, but with your work you sort of interweave a bit of both in there. And I like that personally, because it's more comprehensive. And one of the topics that I found pretty interesting was about how you went over how it's a myth that men and women were sort of like, men were just highly more educated than women were throughout history.
No. You see, this is one of the many instances of what people call the apex fallacy. In other words, it's a focus of attention on the elite end of society. And if you focus on the elite end of society, then it's true that for a long time, only men could take degrees and women couldn't. And so that gives you that impression. But at that time, when that was true, the number of people of any sex getting degrees was absolutely tiny, and it was only the moneyed classes that had that available to them. So for the vast majority of people, education was much the same. You can see this. I mean, I forget what I put in the book on this, but there's certainly OECD data on education attainment going back to 1900 or even just a bit before. And you can see from that data that there's very little difference between the sexes. What changed was the graph over time. So if you look at, for example, the number of years at school, that's gradually increased over the last 120 years. But if you plot the graph separately for males and females, they're parallel to each other and very close together. There might be a few % difference, but it's negligible in comparison with the change over time. I mean, I have a personal example. My parents were educated in the 1930s, and both of them left school at 13, both of them. And if you go a few decades earlier than that, they would both have left school at the age of 10 or 11. So there was no, for the vast majority of people, there was no difference. It was only at the elite end there was a difference. And it isn't entirely the case that women weren't educated. They were just differently educated, because for the elite women, they required different skills. Elite women were focused on getting a good marriage. And to do that, they needed things like finishing school and learning French and learning to play the piano and these sort of artistic accomplishments and social accomplishments, which were going to be valued by their prospective husbands. There was very little value in learning Latin and Greek and getting a degree in law, because that was the man's job. So we lived in it, 100+ years ago. It was a gendered society. There's no question about that. But a gendered society doesn't imply that one side was oppressed. It just means that the sexes had different roles, and that's perfectly natural, by the way. All human societies have sex segregated roles. I mean, it's one of the most elementary things about anthropology. It's not unique to Western culture. So yes, you're quite right. It's the history of education is one of the many myths. And in any case, if you look at how things are now, when as soon as more people started to go to university, the gender ratio rapidly equilibrated, and women very quickly overtook men, as we know. I mean, in the UK, women have been the majority of undergraduates now for 30 years. And the number of women at university exceeds the number of men at undergraduate level by about 37%. It's quite a big difference. So it's very difficult to do this calculation, but I have tried to do it, and I suspect that if you take the whole of history, for the UK, over the whole of history, which sex has been awarded more degrees? And I think the answer is now women.
Yeah, and I mean, even with and when it comes to American history, I mean, we've had presidents that had very little education themselves. Like, for example, our first president here, George Washington, I believe he only had maybe 2 or 3 years of education, and that was mostly just basic reading, writing, and a little bit of math. And even a little bit way after that, with our other, the 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, he had really maybe about a grand total of maybe a year of schooling when you add up, because he moved different places and got tiny bits of education here and there. And so altogether, he even joked about and said he only had maybe a year or 2 of education when you added all of it up, and it was mainly this basic stuff. So yeah, I mean, this idea what we have nowadays, where someone is in school for 20 or plus years of their life, that's a relatively new thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, education in the sense of going to university was the province of a tiny number. And remember the history, certainly in the UK, getting degrees was all tied up with holy orders. It was difficult or impossible to get a degree unless you also took holy orders at one point. The two things were closely intertwined, and that was another reason why they didn't give degrees to women, because women couldn't take holy orders. So the history of it is quite complex when you start going to those issues, but it doesn't really matter because you're talking about a tiny, tiny number of people, not the vast majority. You know, my favorite anecdote in terms of education and history is Christabel Pankhurst. Christabel Pankhurst, daughter of Emmeline Pankhurst. When the First World War broke out, Christabel and Emmeline broke off their campaigning for the vote in favour of going around exhorting men to join up and go to the trenches, specifically to save them. Actually, it was incredibly selfish motivation. But the amusing thing, well, blackly amusing thing about that is she would have been addressing crowds of working class men, half of whom, at least half of whom, would not have had the vote any more than she did. At least half of them would not have had the vote. But not only that, they would all have left school at about 10. And she, Christabel Pankhurst, had a degree. Incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
But you don't hear that being said, do you?
Yeah. I mean, like, even in America, that was a lot of the case where, I remember with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, where they had actually had sort of a argument with another famous person, abolitionist, named Frederick Douglass, where basically, like, it was pointed out with them is that many of the feminists in there were all, like, they were either upper middle class to wealthy people, and a lot of them, the reason why they got into politics was because of the fact that their husbands were politicians, and they traveled alongside the circles with their husbands and did politics alongside with them. So, like, so these women were saying that, hey, women have no say in politics, all the while they literally are traveling with their husbands, talking to other politicians in that circle.
Yeah, I mean, women have always had influence over things, even if they didn't have the formal status of that influence. Because a lot of these political things would have taken place in that sort of era, in people's drawing rooms, in soirees, in evening events where the great and the good got together. And this was the milieu in which women shone, because they organized such things. I mean, read War and Peace. I mean, okay, that's set in Russia, but the process would have been the same. You'll see that in the peace bits, it's very much women controlling the political narrative. That's what that book is largely about. And I suspect it was always the same. So women have always had a lot of indirect influence, which is in some ways beneficial, because it means you can have the influence without bearing the responsibility.
Yeah.
And that sounds familiar, doesn't it, in the context of feminism?
Yeah. I remember actually how I had another MRA on named Kay Valentine, and he had brought up how, if anything, one could actually make the argument that feminists actually, in the UK at least, actually hurt women's ability to get the vote sooner because of terrorist activities that they were doing. So if anything, women could have gotten the vote earlier than they did, but the feminist movement because of terrorism that they were doing, became associated with that bad stuff. So in some way, they could blame them for not getting it earlier.
Yeah, well, I have a 26-part YouTube series on the history of universal suffrage in the UK. So if you want chapter and verse on the history specific to the UK, modestly, I recommend that. But it's certainly the case, and you're quite right, it's certainly the case that the suffragettes did not in any way accelerate getting the vote for women. That is certainly the case, and they were a terrorist group. They were bombers. They created havoc by setting fire to people's houses and letting off bombs in train stations, and there wasn't just one or two. It went on for years, and there was lots of it. It's a forgotten history. People have airbrushed the suffragette bombers out of the collective memory, but they were a terrorist group. You know, it was the feminists. Well, I'll call them feminists. I suppose that's what they were, the suffragettes. But they invented the pipe bomb. People in Britain think the IRA invented the pipe bomb, but no, the suffragettes were there half a century earlier. Incredible, isn't it? So yes, that's true. They very much caused the political class, which of course was all men in Parliament at the time, to look askance at the very idea of suffrage for women, if this is how they were going to behave. But actually the suffragettes, you know, the Pankhurst mob, were only a small fraction of the women's suffrage movement. The larger movement was headed by Millicent Fawcett and her NUWSS, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. And she campaigned under a banner which read non-militant suffragists. So suffragists was the term that they used. And pointedly, she non-militant. She was distancing herself from the violent suffragette movement. And it was actually when in the closing years during the First World War, when there was something called the Speakers' Conference, which led to the 1918 Representation of the People Act, which was the act which gave the vote to the majority of women for the first time, and also gave the vote to about 50% of men as well, actually, although people forget that bit. There was something called the Speakers' Conference, which was the prelude to drafting this act, basically. And it was not the Pankhursts that got invited to the table. Absolutely not. There was no way. They'd put themselves beyond the pale. But Millicent Fawcett was represented. I don't think she was personally involved, but her views were represented round that table that formed that act. So there's a huge difference between the non-violent suffragist movement and the violent one. Yeah. However, the deep history is much more interesting than that, because the deep history and the real reason why women didn't get the vote earlier is nothing to do with women. It's nothing to do either with a hegemony of, you know, patriarchal male MPs. As Emmeline Pankhurst knew herself and wrote in her memoir, there had been a majority support in the House of Commons for some form of female suffrage since the Third Reform Act of, if I get the date right, 1885, I think it was, or 87, mid-1880s. There had been majority support. So why then did women not get the vote? What would that be? 20 years earlier than they did? Well, the reason is simple. It's because half of men did not have the vote yet. That's the reason. And if you ignore the male side of the equation, which people invariably do, feminist people that certainly do, then you will never get to understand that period. But the point is, it was impossible to franchise any women before men had been fully franchised. And it's something I call the big snag, and it's worth me sort of labouring this because so few people know of it. But what was being put forward in the closing decades of the 19th century was not suffrage for all women, because only half the men had the vote. So you couldn't possibly put forward suffrage for all women. What the Pankhursts were trying to get was not that. It was suffrage for upper class women, for respectable women, as they would put it. Emmeline Pankhurst was a Tory, by the way. And that's another thing that's forgotten. Anyway, so the best that could be done for women would be to give the vote to a small number of upper crust women. But the parties in Parliament that in principle supported suffrage for women it was the Liberal Party that would support them in principle. The Conservatives were against it on principle. So the Liberals weren't going to support a movement to give a few million upper crust women the vote because they assumed, being upper crust, they would vote Tory. And so the Liberals couldn't vote in favour of women's suffrage because of the skew in the socio-economics. But they couldn't give the vote to all women either because not all men had the vote. So you see, the only way round it was to give the vote to everyone, both sexes, all classes. Universal suffrage was the only way that any women could ever get the vote. That's the big snag, which no one now understands. But that's the deep and interesting history. And how did it become unsnagged? Well, the clue is that the Representation of the People Act was passed in 1918, with the First World War still raging. You think that's a coincidence? No, it's not a coincidence. It's because the barrier to women getting the vote was that working class men had not got the vote. That is the real truth. And that snag, in other words, the political class were not against women, they were against working class men. That was the real problem. Emmeline Pankhurst knew this. She said it in a memoir. Millicent Fawcett knew it as well. She also wrote it. They were perfectly well aware of what the problem was. They were, but it's been forgotten since.
Yeah.
So women eventually got the vote in the First World War because it was the First World War that overcame the class prejudice that had prevented working class men being given the vote. Because what you had in the trenches were upper class officers in the trenches with working class men, living the same appalling lives, dying the same appalling deaths. And that overcame the class barrier. That was the snag. That was the unsnagging of the snag. And you can read this in the Hansard record, the record of the proceedings of Parliament. It's all perfectly clear, the history, if you go through it. And so the truth is, and to put it really bluntly, the truth is that women got the vote because of men's bodies in the trenches. You can see why they don't want that one being said too loudly. Anyway, I've regaled you enough on that one, but it's one of my specialist topics.
Well, I mean, I do find it all interesting myself. And in America, like, what's funny is like how many people in the woke camp, they will regale about racism. They won't actually admit the history that part of the reason why women got the vote was because of racism. Because what had happened is that there had been infighting amongst abolitionist and feminist over who should get the vote first, like women or black people. And Frederick Douglass, who I brought up before, he had made the argument that, well, black people deserve the vote more because, like, women at the very least have indirect representation by their husbands. We don't even have that. And they couldn't really argue against that. And it sort of went back and forth for a while. And here's the thing, once black men got the vote, and the reason why they got the vote was because they fought in the Civil War. And so they said, well, we can't just we can't just have these people fight this war help fight us this war and not give them something. And so black men ended up getting the vote partially because of the fact that they fought in the war. And especially the upper middle class to wealthy white women, they were furious that black men got the vote before them. They said, because they felt like these people, like, they're superior than these men, and that became they doubled down and went even further, and eventually that led to women getting the vote. So they're never going to tell you that side of the story.
No, well, I was unaware of that. I haven't been into the American history, but it does sound like there are certain parallels there with the UK experience, particularly in respect of the relevance of war, of overcoming previous barriers to enfranchisement. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean that's how it's pretty much always been the case. Like I even remember, even in ancient Athens, it was sort of a given that war, like the reason why men had the vote and not women was precisely because part of being an Athenian citizen was having to have military training.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And women didn't have to have military training.
Mm.
So yeah, and here's what's another funny thing that people don't tell you about is that another reason why women didn't get the vote beforehand was because they weren't demanding it. Like they understood back then, like what the vote was tied to. It was tied to military service and the like. And women would say, "So wait, you're saying that I'm going to have to risk my life to fight a war or whatever in order to vote? No, thank you. Nope, you can get that. I'm not doing that." And so throughout a lot of human history, we've only like recently forgot it, is that like there was not a really big push for women getting the vote. It was only once technology really advanced far enough to where people had more free time to actually engage in politics, and that women could, get more involved in politics, because people don't remember how being a homemaker back like a long time ago, that was pretty much a full-time job, even more.
Yeah.
So I mean, women back then didn't really have, like, poor women, that is, didn't have this whole, like, didn't have time to get interested in politics as much. They were too
No,
busy.
absolutely. Yeah.
So they were, but once technology had advanced to the point where, hey, women could have more free time to actually get involved in these things, then that's coincidentally when they got the vote, because now they actually had more of an opportunity to get involved in it. So I mean, it wasn't like men were holding women back from it. It's like men are expected to be mind readers and know this beforehand. Like men only know what's being demanded of them, and they weren't like no one was demanding women get the vote until relatively recently.
No, I mean, I don't know that we have any reliable data on, what percentage of women actually wanted the vote, even in 1918 when they got it, because it's like all these things. The suffragists and the suffragettes, they would have been a small minority of all women, that's for sure. So how many women actually supported it? I don't know. I mean, certainly there were many outspoken women that were against it, but how the numbers stacked up, I don't know. The other thing I'd add, I mean, they're all valid points you're raising there. The other valid observation, of course, is that the areas of politics that women are now most concerned with didn't really exist then, because there was no welfare state. So, you know, there was much less that would naturally be of interest to women. Politics was about foreign affairs, executing wars, and property ownership and property rights. That was the bulk of it.
Yeah, so not like sexy stuff.
Not the sort of, no, not like, you know, childcare and healthcare and education. I mean, the poor law was something that was it was handled by the parish. It wasn't the business of national politics, because there was no national poor law. You know, that if you were unemployed and in danger of starving, you threw yourself on the parish. In other words, you'd end up being supported essentially by people you knew in the parish. That's how it worked. And the same was true of education. I mean, people, there was no state education. It was all locally arranged. You know, they had dame schools, didn't they, where some widow with time on her hands would educate a few children. So it was all very local and very informal, and not the business. And there was no welfare state in terms of healthcare either. That didn't come in the UK until after the Second World War. So there was much less to naturally interest women at that time.
Yeah. And also, like, I don't know if you exactly, well, actually, yeah, you did go over this, but people often say that when it comes to medicine, that things are actually more biased for men because we apparently know more about like things like men's heart than we do women's. What is your sort of take on that?
Well, I mean, the big picture on health is that the bottom line is that the bottom line comes sooner for men. How about that for a bottom line? And it's not just I mean, everyone knows male longevity is somewhat less than women's, but I think the way probably most people look at that is that there's only a few years in it. And in any case, it's when you're old, so who cares? So in the UK, the average longevity for men now is about 79, and for women it's about 83, something like that. It varies with socio-demographics. So if you're wealthier, there's a smaller difference between the sexes. In the lower socio-economic groups, there's a bigger difference. It might be 8, 9, 10 years in very poor communities. But that, to me, doesn't tell the story. The story is told more when you look at premature death. So you can define premature death as death before the age of 75. And men die, there's about 43% more men die prematurely than women. So you're not talking about a few years or a few percent, it's 43%. It's a huge difference. And if you look at even earlier than that to early death, which I would define as death before the age of 45, then men are, I think it's 73% more likely to die before 45. And of course, as we know, the leading cause of death in men up to age 45 is suicide. So, I mean, those are much more hard-hitting stats than just a few years. There's a big difference, and in terms of people. You see, people will always find some way of turning around the big picture and looking at some microcosm that makes it look like, oh, in that area, men are advantaged. So I think the sort of thing you're alluding to there is, and one of the things that I've heard feminists bring up is proving of new drugs is biased in favour of men because all the tests are done on men. Well, I've never had the opportunity of asking one of them, well, how do you think they get people to volunteer to take an experimental drug and they're not quite sure what it's going to do to you? They don't force people at gunpoint, you know. They ask for volunteers. And guess who volunteers? That will be men, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly men. Why? Well, because men are less risk averse than women. It's, you know, well-known characteristics, gendered characteristic. Women tend to be more risk averse, and you can say that men are a bit crazy if you like, but I mean, however you want to express it, more men volunteer. That's why the tests are done on men, and the only way you could change that would be to force women to take experimental drugs. Is that what you want to do? I've never had the opportunity to putting that question to a feminist, but really they look desperately for things to make it look like women are disadvantaged. There's a classic case. Last International Men's Day in Parliament, we've now have an annual debate on International Men's Day. It's not a regular fixture, but the backbenchers, as the so-called, the less powerful MPs, have an opportunity to put forward topics for debates. And there's a few sort of male-friendly MPs that have been putting this forward for the last few years. So we got a debate, and in any debate, the relevant minister has to be there. Now, who's the relevant minister for issues affecting men? Oh, well, there isn't one, of course. But the nearest equivalent is it's usually the Minister for Women and Equalities has to attend, because that's the nearest they have. On this occasion, it was the minister, a woman minister, who had the portfolio for health. So one of the MPs, bless his cotton socks, asked her outright, why do we have a health policy for women and we don't have a health policy for men? Because that's true. There's a government health strategy for women, which is led by the Department for Health, and there isn't one for men. Why? So the answer she got, well, there's no good answer, because the actual answer is, oh, well, it's prejudice, actually. But the answer she came up with was because women spend more years in ill health than men. That's why. Okay, you want to examine that statement? Women spend more years in ill. Why would that be? That will be because they live longer. So why? So in other words, they're saying that because men die earlier, they can't have a health strategy. It was the logical corollary, but it makes your head spin. I think Karen Strawn once called this pretzel logic, which is a beautiful expression. Pretty much summarize it. Pretzel logic, it's twisting things about till you can somehow get it into a shape which looks like it's fair, but no.
Yeah. And like another thing is that when it comes to the medical stuff is that like it's not even just volunteers, it's that also where are they pulling these volunteers from? And there's generally three groups that they pulled them from: the homeless, the military, and prisoners. Well, who makes up the majority of all three of these categories?
Yeah, that too. Yeah. I mean, I'm not quite sure. They certainly get them sometimes from the military in the UK. I don't think they get them from the homeless. The homeless would not be a good choice, you know. If by homeless you mean rough sleepers, that they would not be a good choice because they're not in very good health. They're in appallingly bad health, most of them. So I doubt that in the UK we pick on the homeless. I'm not sure about prisoners. They might ask prisoners, I don't know. But offering drugs to prisoners is a bit of a risk, I would suggest.
Yeah. Well, it's all about disposability.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. If a prisoner dies because of experimental drugs, oh well, he was a robber. Who cares? So
yeah, I'm not sure whether the authorities are quite that cynical, but you might be right.
Yeah. But that's sort of how it is, and also just like also if we were going to take even all that out, it's also another fact that men have heart attacks more than women do.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. That's still the case. It was always the case, and it is still the case. And
Yeah, so
it's partly lifestyle issues, smoking more, drinking more, but it's also genetic. I mean, this is what I try and get across to people. You shouldn't just say it's all lifestyle, because there are known genetic differences that predispose men to disease more. We have weaker immune system. Testosterone is an immunosuppressant. It's well known, and the fact that it's not lifestyle is proved if you look at the death rate for babies still in the womb, fetuses, and for very young children, babies and very young children. It's always males that die preferentially. It's however tender an age. So there's clearly a biological component. They haven't managed to take on board toxic masculinity when they're still in the womb, I suggest.
yeah, and I mean, here's the thing. Even like so, when you take into consideration, is that I mean, if you're going to be like if your job is that you're supposed to treat heart attacks, and the people that are having heart attacks more are men, well, you're naturally going to be dealing with more men anyway. I mean, and another funny thing that people don't tell you about is like it's only in certain fields where like there's more of a skew towards like men when it comes to test subjects. We know far more, say, about depression in mothers than we do about depression in fathers.
Yeah. Postnatal depression in fathers is a thing, but there's not very much known about it.
Yes.
And
Only
you can understand that one, by the way. I mean, I'm not against these things being gender skewed when there's a reason. I mean, God knows what pregnancy does to your endocrine system. I mean, heavens, you can see why everything will be topsy-turvy for the woman. I mean, all the practical issues of looking after a new child and having all that stuff going on in your hormones at the same time is, I mean, it's no wonder that they're rather fragile at that time. So, I'm not against there being, focused attention on those issues. But as you say, it's sometimes it's justifiable, and it's yes, and it's justifiable to focus on one sex if they're the ones suffering from the condition, which in the case of cardiovascular conditions is the case.
Yeah. And well, I mean, yeah, men suffer from like post-birth depression. They see the bill for the hospital. That'll make any man depressed.
Well,
At least,
fortunately, we don't see a bill, not normally.
well, yeah. Well, you see it in your taxes.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah.
Yeah. Um, and it is often said that the reason men commit suicide more than women is because men just use more deadly means.
We're
Do you
we're,
think?
be- we're better at DIY, and that's the reason.
Yeah. I mean, do you think because like men are more goal focused in their mind? Like if like men tend to have like when men commit to something, they like whether it be a job or in this sadly case suicide,
Yeah,
it it's more goal oriented.
I think that may have a lot to do with it. Yeah, yeah. I, I mean, what people do cite on that one is that it's for women, it's a cry for help. Um, and maybe there's some truth in that. So they perhaps don't try too hard, or they take the tablets, but make sure they phone someone up as soon as they have. So there may be some truth in that. And of course, for men, it's less likely to be a cry for help because they know that they're not going to get any in most cases. I mean, I was a trustee for a charity that assists people after parental separation, particularly with child contact issues, which inevitably means it's dominated by fathers. Not exclusively, there are women as well have problems, but it's mostly fathers. And the prevalence of suicidality in that demographic is frighteningly large. It's about 25% have either are having or have recently had suicidal ideation, and about 5% of our registrants have attempted suicide before they register with us. So, you know, these are percentages that are several orders of magnitude higher than in the general population. Terrifying. And yeah, I mean, you get close up and personal with their stories, which all bear a relationship to each other. And basically there's very little help for them. That's the bottom line. I just want to see the kids, and we try and help them as much as we can, but you know, there's limits to what we can do. And
yeah. And like what I've also found out is that when it comes to like a reason why they say it could be the fact that men tend to be more goal focused is because they've done studies on men and women who aren't depressed at all. And they'd ask them a question like, if you were to commit suicide, like what means would you do? And men more often than not would choose things like shotgun or some guns, crash their car. You know, they chose, while women would choose things like overdosing, cutting, and stuff like that. And when you go over the like, what are you more likely to die from? The men's preferred methods tend to be more fatal.
yeah, I mean, the preferred method in the UK, it certainly used to be, I haven't looked at recent stats, but it used to be, certainly with men, hanging. And you can see why that is successful, because once you've kicked away that chair, there's no going back, is there?
Yeah. Whereas when it comes to cutting, you can do it and then say, "Oh, great," and then call the police, and they do something unless you've done it too far. But you're more likely to get help on that occasion. And I think it all does go to another thing where, like, they call it a chivalry bias, and there has been studies that show that men lack a sort of automatic bias towards other men. And in fact, studies have been done that show that, like, when they ask men if you had, like, they do the whole trolley example, where if you had to say, who would you save, a man or a woman? Mm-hmm. Men would not say they would save the woman before they would save a man. And so they've said that men have a lesser sense of bias towards themselves than women do other women. And that made me think, how can patriarchy really arise if men don't have this innate sense?
It can't. You put your finger right on it. Patriarchy is not only wrong, it's impossible for that reason. Men, it's quite unusual. Most well-defined groups will have in-group preference. So women have in-group preference, but men do not have in-group preference. And it's fairly obvious, actually, because what do we know about men? We know that men are competitive and hierarchical. Well, that's the opposite of in-group preference. But men, whilst they're competitive with other men are not very comfortable competing with women. And that's because they preference women. This is the fundamental psychology behind gynocentrism and male disposability. And as you quite rightly say, the corollary of that, the corollary of men not having in-group preference, is that there could not be a conspiracy of men to oppress women, because the basic male psychology lacking in-group preference means that it would never happen. This is something I learned the hard way, because years ago, in my early days as an MRA, I had this fantasy I could grow what I called an army. I don't mean a fighting army. I mean an army to do constructive activism. And I kept trying, and it would never happen. And it's actually notorious that in our movement that although people are friendly enough, they don't form a cohesive sort of force equivalent to feminism. And the reason is we don't have that mechanism for that in-group cohesion, because we don't have in-group preference. And I see it in the charity as well. I mean, men come to us and we help them, and when their case is settled, they disappear. They don't stick around to help. You know, not 1 in 1,000 sticks around to help. It's notorious, but it's all because of the lack of in-group preference amongst men, which is a great weakness in men, but it's actually also a great strength. And it's important that the strength of it is recognized, because it's all part of being self-reliant. You have to be self-reliant if you don't have the same group support that other people might have. So all these things are wrapped up with, you know, the different gendered roles. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, really. And like another common thing that I see get brought up a lot is basically, you know, the male CEOs and all that stuff, like men making up a higher proportion of male CEOs. And a thing that got me thinking about, and I actually did do some research into this, and it was found out that men have, like, when it comes to values, men tend to value privacy less than women do. And that made me think of something. Do you think men and women's willingness to sacrifice only certain things can lead to disparities in, like, in management?
Oh, heavens, yes. I mean, again, that's something fundamental. And men are more work focused. If by work we mean paid work, not work in the home, then men are much more work focused than women. This is why women prefer to work part-time after a certain age. It's not only childcare, although that comes into it. They prefer to work part-time anyway. The majority of general practitioners, you know, doctors in primary healthcare in the UK, the majority of them now are women, and 86% of them work part-time. Whereas if you go back a couple of decades, when virtually all general practitioners were men, very few doctors worked part-time. They were all not just full-time, but they worked every hour God sent. And there's been a radical change because of the change in the gender balance. But you see that throughout. I mean, some women are very career oriented and do get to be CEOs and the like, but it's uncharacteristic of women, whereas it is characteristic of men if they have the ability. So yeah, without question, and it's because of what we were just talking about, the fact that men are competitive and hierarchical. If you want to get to the top, how are you going to do that without being competitive?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it also just goes into sacrificing, like, what are you willing to give up?
Absolutely.
Because like, and the thing is that people don't often realize this, but there's sort of an inverse relationship between power and privacy. Meaning, if you want to be the president or you want to be a CEO, typically you're going to have to realize that there's always going to be cameras watching you. There's going to always be people that want to interview you. And there's always going to be people that want to know every minute detail of your life.
And there's always going to be people that are going to blame you for everything that goes wrong. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And, you know, so in order to accrue that sort of power, you have to be saying, all right, I'm willing to sacrifice privacy in order to get. Well, on average, men tend to value that privacy a little bit less, and women tend to value it a lot more. Well, how are women going to become the male CEO? How are they going to become the CEOs unless they're going to be willing to sacrifice that?
Yeah, that's right. Warren Farrell is very good on these issues in terms of, you know, expressing it in terms of the pay gap, which is sort of what you're talking about, really. You know, you're quite right. Men are willing to sacrifice a lot more to go up the greasy pole or to earn more money than women are, and it's because of the competitiveness, the hierarchy, and the fact that, remember, men are human doings, not human beings. We are only as good as our function.
Yeah. And another thing that people bring up, it also comes down to social networking, where like what are the genders better at when it comes to social networking? Women tend to be better at men when it comes to having smaller but more personal like social networks, whereas men tend to be better at forming larger but less personal relation like networks. Well, when it comes to being a CEO, it matters a whole lot more to be good at making large but less personal networks than it is to have smaller personal networks.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's what the sociologists say, and you can see why. And it's also related to one of the key cognitive differences between the sexes, in that women tend to be more empathic and emotional. These are generalities, of course, but they tend to be more empathic and emotional, and men tend to be more systematizing and logical. And those things are what align with the different group sizes you were talking about. So being empathic and emotionally based works well in small groups, but you can't apply it beyond a certain size. You can't empathize with, you know, all 320 million people in the USA, can you, at once? So when you get to a certain size, being more systematizing and logical is the recourse you have to deploy. So that's part of the underlying psychology that leads to those sociological differences.
Yeah,
And it's also related, of course, to men's lack of in-group preference. Again, that there's a plus side to it. The plus side to men's lack of in-group preference is it leads to them being more equipped to build very large scale social structures, because you can't do that based on in-group preference. You can only do it based on systems. So
yeah,
this is something that I've never really entirely got clear in my own mind, but I feel quite strongly that the male psychology is key to having large scale harmonious societies, and you can't achieve that based on the female more intimate way of behaving. And that's why I think that's the fundamental reason why across the whole Western world now we're finding our societies are falling apart, because the feminist influence has put female psychology in a place where it can't sustain large-scale harmonious societies. There's something very fundamental going on there that I haven't managed to quite formulate coherently, but I'm pretty sure that's something to do with it. Perhaps you can add something to that.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think that goes into also, I believe, what you've called organized chaos, where you sort of have mentioned where you don't think there necessarily has to be a conspiracy for groups to have like-minded interest, where like I believe you gave the example of how, let's say you're growing a garden and you just decide to not do anything, and eventually you get rabbits and insects that are eating at your crops. Well, the rabbits and the insects didn't come together and conspire to to eat your food.
Yeah, I'm being oppressed by rabbits.
Yeah, yeah. So that's what's called like organized chaos, where two groups don't have to necessarily even be in any contact with each other in order to have like-minded interests.
Yeah, yeah. I think the analogy I used was weeds in my garden. There isn't a conspiracy amongst the weeds to take over my garden, but nevertheless they are doing. It happens quite spontaneously. All that's necessary is that I don't stop them. So
Yeah,
yeah, there are natural processes at work, and I mean, I'm sure you probably get this as well. The accusation of conspiracy theory every time you voice an opinion which isn't mainstream opinion. Um, but these things don't need conspiracy. Um, I don't know if you're familiar with my book, The Destructivists, where I outline my theory of moral usurpation being the sort of the prime MO of the politics that we're now suffering from. But the one sort of the pinnacle of that moral usurpation process is the woke industrial complex and how that works. And that, from the outside, you could say it looks like a conspiracy, but it isn't. It's just a symbiotic process of people looking after their own interests and coming together, because if they come together, they can look after their own interests better. And so this is how you get the elites, as we now call them, doing things which are authoritarian and contrary to the interests of nations and the bulk of people in the nations, because we've allowed it to happen. The weeds are growing because we've allowed it to happen. And in this context, what we've allowed to happen is the arising of a system of fake morality in place of true morality. And that takes us rather off the gender topic into more general politics. But yeah, it's the issue that I've moved into more over recent years, because it's so pressing. It's so pressing. I mean, what you will know in more detail what's happening in the States, but even from here, I can see that it's not pretty, and it's not much better in the UK either, or Europe generally. It's
yeah,
quite worrying.
I know. And this will be the final question, but we've talked a lot about um how society is favoring women and going hands over heels to just go for women. But it's kind of interesting that this hasn't translated to women being happier. And in fact, um, women are actually have become more miserable over time. So,
Mm.
I mean, it hasn't even like if the goal was to make women happy and more comfortable with their life, I mean, it hasn't worked.
No, it hasn't, but that wasn't the goal, of course.
Yeah,
That was the false flag that the feminist movement has sailed under: equality and making women's lives better. But it's not really what they were ever doing. I mean, what they really wanted to do was to make women independent of men, independent financially and independent domestically. That's what they wanted. And what's that motivated by? It's motivated fundamentally by a hatred of men. It's a movement founded on hatred, ultimately. And so no good could possibly ever come of it. And yes, it's more and more women, I think, are realizing that it's the root of their problems. I mean, there's a lot of, young women get to 30 odd, they really want to marry, have children, be a mother, and they can't find a matching partner. And a lot of them are realizing that feminism is the reason. You can't find a matching partner either because they price themselves out of the market, because they're only going to accept a man that has an earning power at least as great as theirs, and they've been quite successful. So there's a diminishing pool of of eligible men and they've already been snapped up, or there's simply a large proportion of men now who are just not interested, even though they would be eligible financially and socially and so on. They think, no, it's not worth the, it's a game that's not worth the candle. You see, men have been robbed of respect completely. I mean, that's the most destructive thing about the gender issues is the withdrawal of respect from men. It was such a good bargain for women, wasn't it? That, you only had to give man respect and he'd literally die for you. But that wasn't enough, apparently. And so no, there's no respect for men now. There's just endless vilification. Until the majority of women realise they've been conned by their own side, this is going to continue. And part of that will be that women have to realise that they are actually powerful, and they were always powerful. And what they've been doing for the last half century is abusing their power.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's another thing is like, I mean, if you care about women's happiness, which I mean, I do, and I think any MRA legitimately does care about women's happiness, but it's really not working with everything that's going, because women are, like, I believe I even heard that more women are actually becoming alcoholics these days.
I would imagine so, yeah. I mean, well, they've been encouraged to become more like men. And they thought this was great because they were conned into believing that men were privileged. And so becoming more like men meant they'd be privileged. But there's a bit of a snag to that, because actually men weren't privileged in general. Most men just spent their lives being wage slaves in order to earn enough money to keep a family. And it wasn't privilege, it was contribution and effort. And that was made better for men when it was accompanied by respect and a sense of achievement. But women don't get the same sense of achievement. They're not motivated by respect. And now they're just stuck with having to work for a living and being childless. Yeah, it's no wonder they're unhappy. I mean, it's not what women want. I mean, we used to have things called the social attitude surveys in Britain, in which people were asked about these fundamental things about life, what you want to do, where you want children, and, who should earn the money and who should look after the kids. And the vast majority of people are still traditionalist in that respect. And but the feminists, a small group of women and men, have changed our social structure against the wishes, actually, of the majority of people of both sexes.
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, you're absolutely right that it's going to happen, because I don't like men, despite what people will lead you to believe, they actually, it's going to be a joint effort. It has to be both men raising a stink about it, but it also has to be women that realize that they have more power than that's been let on, and they're going to have to, which is why I like the honey badgers, where you have these group of women that are actually, they're making the point, and I think that's an indispensable good that's needed if we're going to shift the window to better outcomes for both sexes, to be quite frank.
Yeah, but yes, that's right. I mean, women have particular power in this respect. I mean, they command attention that women, that men that don't command. I mean, partly it's to do with the fact that the nature of the human pair bond involves a ceding of moral authority from man to woman. That's a fundamental part of what it is, and by extension, that applies to all women. That's where that's where what I call matricentrism comes from. And matricentrism is the natural preferencing of women as a surrogate for the child, which is an evolved condition because it's evolutionarily beneficial. But gynocentrism is a corruption of that, where women usurp that moral authority on behalf of themselves, and the child disappears from the picture. But nevertheless, women still are naturally possessed of that moral authority, which men do not really command at, and we never will, I don't think. So yeah, I mean, every female MRA is worth 10 male MRAs, so to speak.
And this is a bit of relevance, but I always find it funny. Is like it's commonly said that there's an alt-right to MRA pipeline, but whenever I see it, it's more like there's a feminism to MRA pipeline, meaning most of the MRAs that I know were former feminist.
Oh, really? Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, like I know Warren Farrell for one was one of them.
Yeah.
And I mean, Paul Elam has said that. I mean, he said that he was basically a feminist beforehand.
That's hard to envisage, isn't it?
And yeah, so I mean, and I mean, it's even become a running gag on The Voice for Men where feminists are actually called the male, like they're called the MRA marketing department because people will see feminists and see how crazy they're acting and say, oh, well, we need to just go to the MRA side on this one. So indirectly, feminists are actually the best marketing tool for the MRAs.
Yeah, well, that is so, actually. I mean, I don't get very many feminists leaving comments on my blog site, but I do like it when they do, because I think they think I'm going to not allow their comments to come through. But no, quite the contrary. I really like it when they do their feminist thing, and because they're the best advert for our argument. It's what they say, the crazy things they say. So I'm delighted when they leave comments.
Well, it was so nice having you on. Can you tell the audience about future plans? I know you said that you're writing a book, another book. Do you have any other projects like lectures, videos, or what have you?
No, nothing of that sort. I think the book will be probably be out in a small number of months. It will be a compilation of blog pieces, as I say. So people that have assiduously read every word of my blog over 10 years, well, first of all, commiserations, and perhaps you need to see a psychiatrist, but you won't get so much out of the book. But the main advantage of the book is it pulls together things into subject order, and of course it's not just cut and paste, it's sort of fairly heavily edited. So hopefully it'll be worthwhile doing that. That's the main thing I'm working on there. I am on the agenda to speak at ICMI 24 in Budapest for those that want to make the trip over there. What else have we got on the agenda? Not that much at the moment, really. I mean, I have over the last few years been doing a lot of work for the charity that I mentioned, which is now running down a bit, thankfully. But I have a lot of other interests that are outside gender and politics and the madness. You have to try and restore your sanity. I'm probably the only person I know that I restore my sanity by doing physics. Yeah, there's nothing so real as equations.
Yeah, but yeah, it was so nice having you on.
Pleasure.
And discussing these matters.
Well,
And
we've barely scratched the surface, but that's inevitable.
yeah, can you tell the audience where they can find you?
Well, I blog on Empathy Gap UK, empathygap.uk. That's my blog, and I have a YouTube channel in my name, William Collins.
All right. Well, it was so nice having you on, my good sir. And this is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.